Chapterspooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapterspooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. I'm your podcast host, Matthew A.J. Anderson, horror author, narratologist, word nerd, and anxiety engineer. And welcome to Season 2 of Chapterspooks, and for this season I've decided that I wanted all of my books to have some theme, something in common that links them all together. And so we're covering more than one series for this one, but every single one will have a gimmick. So when I say gimmick, I've noticed that a lot of kids' books, in order to sell kids on books as though books themselves aren't interesting enough, they decide that they throw in something that makes it a little bit kitsch, a little bit gimmicky. So for very little kids, sometimes they'll have pop-up sections, they'll have different textures for the kids, they might even have buttons that they can press to play certain sounds. And when kids get older, they have things like activities in the back of the book. I've seen mazes and word searches and even weird little quizzes like, oh, how much like the main character are you? Could you avoid the monster? Technically, Bone Chiller's had a couple of these things, but I wasn't too focused on them because, well, it wasn't that gimmicky and it was only usually 1 or 2 pages. But these books that I'm going to be covering this season all have a gimmick which is throughout the book, but it doesn't necessarily affect the text. See, the reason why I'm looking at gimmicks this season is because I can somewhat empathize with the idea of gimmicks, because as a writer I like to explore different ideas, I like to play with different modes of writing, different formatting, and so I love ergodic literature. For those of you who don't know, ergodic literature is literature which means that the reader has to put in a little bit more effort when reading it, because it comes from the word root erg, which means energy, so ergodic, requiring more energy to read. The easiest example I can think of are game books. So those are books where you can't read them from cover to cover. Every now and then the page will have instructions at the bottom saying if you want to do this, go to this page, you want to do this, go to that page. And so you can't just read it from start to end. You need to put in a little bit more effort to read the book. And there's all kinds of different ways of doing this. Sometimes the words are written in code, or they change sizes, or they move around the page. You might have to turn the page upside down or sideways in order to read the book. They might have different changing colors so that you can't tell who's speaking unless you pay attention to the different ways that it's written. And they can explore different ways of telling a story by changing the formatting, changing from prose into poetry, or perhaps some sort of epistolary type thing. Like, there's all kinds of ways you can make ergodic literature, and I find most of them interesting. But on the spectrum of ways that you can change formatting for a book to make it interesting, on the one end you have ergodic literature and game books, and further down that sliding scale you get to gimmicks, where the book itself isn't changed all that much, but they've just thrown in something to try to catch your interest. Really, it's very little more than a promotional marketing gimmick at that point. And so whilst I empathize, and whilst I understand why people do this kind of thing, I think that is the least interesting way of making a book more engaging for the reader. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's start with the series that we'll be kicking off Season 2 with, and that is FunFax Horror. Now, the books themselves aren't all that different from regular books, although I will point out, to me, Chapterspooks tends to focus on middle grade. That's generally what you mean when saying Chapterspooks books. They're middle grade chapter books that are a bit scary. But these books seem to be, at least from this first book, young adult or teen horror. It's aiming a little bit higher. But the gimmick that makes this one stand out is that this is one of the series of FunFax books. So FunFax Horror is a subset of the main banner of FunFax. And for FunFax books, you can buy the books just as they are and read them, but you're also encouraged to buy a FunFax file. And this is a ring binder that you can put the books into, because the books all have holes punched into all of the pages, and every single page is perforated so that you can tear out the pages and put them in your FunFax file. As a book collector, this gimmick horrifies me. I do not think you should warp, mark, defile, or deface any book, and so the fact that these books are sold so that kids can tear out all of the pages and throw out the cover, I guess, so that they can put it in a separate binder, potentially even changing the order they're in, change the way it looks. I mean, personally, I hate it, but I did a little bit of research, and I couldn't find much about FunFax Horror in particular, but FunFax Spy is what I found a lot of nostalgic posts all about, and a lot of people seem to find it a lot of fun. Only one or two people said, I never used the file, I kept it in the covers, but most people seem to find it really cool, so whilst I hate it, it is a kind of gimmick that kids seemed to like, I suppose. So that doesn't affect too much of the book, although I will say, because I am a book collector, I didn't want to tear these books at all, and so I had to get bull clips and make sure that I held the book tight, and so it was difficult to set this up, but I'm going to use the same method for every single book so it's not going to tear. So please appreciate the amount of effort that went into me making sure that my books are still in good condition, because every single page is easily tearable. By the way, FunFax Horror seems to be a proper anthology with different authors all throughout, and the author of this one is Stephen Boket. I did a little bit of research. He seems to have written a couple of other books in horror, especially he's done some adult books and some younger kids' horror books. He even wrote for another series called Tremors, which I don't yet have. But the most interesting things about him are, first of all, apparently, as well as being an author, he also used to be a teacher and is a trained hypnotherapist. That's a bit interesting. But I also noticed there's some interesting connection with his other books. Like, he mentions the word game players, which was an awkward term. I thought they were just gamers. But he's written another book called Game Players. And there's another connection which I will talk about at the end of the summary because I found it a little interesting. So, all that being said, just because the pages in this book are terrible, does that mean that the story itself is terrible? Well, I went into this one blind, so I think it's only fair that you do as well. So, without further ado, let us begin FunFax Horror number 1, Panic Station, by Stephen Boket. So we begin our story being introduced to a band of survivors wandering through an apocalyptic wasteland after the mutants have taken over. They have some laser bolt guns and they have some swords, but they need to fight the reptiloids in order to survive because most people have been killed. And just as they're about to be attacked by a reptiloid, it leaps upon them and then the screen goes blank. Because, of course, this is a fake out. Our main character, Mark, is playing a video game. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this, but I think that this story justifies it in ways that I've seen other books fail to. So I'm willing to let it pass for now. Because after the TV breaks and it's not working, Mark decides that maybe he should go call his friend Gary, because he's really good at fixing video games. In fact, he's got on even higher levels in these games than our main character ever has. But when he goes downstairs, he sees that his mother, called Sarah, is very upset. See, Mark has an older sister. She's 4 years older than him, called Tina. Mark's sister wants to be some sort of an actress or a model, and so she's been working with this local modeling agency. And she recently had an assignment at the MZTV studio, which is some new TV studio that opened up in town. But Tina isn't home yet, even though she was supposed to be home about 3 hours ago. And the reason Sarah is upset is because she called the modeling agency and asked them why the studio has kept her back so late. And the modeling agency told her that Tina left for home 3 hours ago, which means that she's been missing for 3 hours. So Sarah Watkins calls the police, and she and Mark, they talk to Officer Baxter and they explain what's going on, and he says, look, we'll set out an all points bulletin, we'll make sure that we're all looking out for her, but it's only been 3 hours so far. This may not be anything nefarious. Maybe she's run away or something like that. We'll do everything we can, but we don't want you to worry too much. She may just turn up, so whilst we're searching, you guys should stay here and be by the phone just in case she calls or she wants to get back to you. And so, after the officers leave, we then learn that one of the reasons why Sarah is so upset, in fact she's close to tears, she was crying in an earlier scene, Mark was trying to make her feel better, is because she's a single mother. About 4 years ago, Mark's father walked out on the family, saying he needed to be not tied down, whatever nonsense. But it means that Sarah feels guilty because as a single mother, she feels like if she'd done more, maybe Tina wouldn't have gone missing. She's blaming herself, effectively. And so Mark does what he can to make her feel better. And then he decides to leave her by the phone because that's what makes Sarah feel like she's being useful. But this is when we have him go back upstairs, And this is when it justifies that fake out at the beginning, because he goes upstairs thinking about playing the game, but the television still isn't working, and in fact, where it's got that static on the TV, he starts to see images flickering behind it that almost look like faces, and then he realizes that he needs to talk to Gary. And so I really like it, because even though I don't like the fake out at the beginning, it's important to the story, because we'll later learn that this flickering image is part of the story, but also by the fact that he can't play video games and just ignore it means that he reaches out to his friend, and that's what starts him on his adventure. So, Mark calls his friend Gary, and talking with Gary, they're talking a little bit about video games. When he mentions that his sister's gone missing, Gary also mentions that his twin sister Layla has some friends about Tina's age, and they too seem to have gone missing, but they're all in the local area. And so we've got an interesting mystery going on here. Some of the people in the town seem to be going missing. So with his sister missing and his mum upset, Mark isn't really sure what he can do, but Gary suggests, well, why don't we get on our bikes tomorrow, we'll cruise around town, check out the spots she usually is, maybe we'll find her. And even though Mark doesn't think that'll do much, it'll feel better than doing nothing. So he agrees and says that tomorrow they'll get on their bikes and check around town. He goes to bed that night, and the next day he goes over to Gary's house, and we learn that Mark has a bit of a crush on Gary's twin sister Layla, but as they're talking about getting ready to go around town, that's when Layla suggests that instead of just getting on their bikes, why don't they go to an expert? Because there is a local celebrity called Roy Case. He's a detective. He's got the Case on the Case TV series where he talks about mysteries that he's solved around town, and she has already gotten in touch with him and organized a meeting for 12 o'clock midday. So as midday comes around, they head to the SBTV studios, which is the Solid Broadcasting Television Network studio, because this is where Roy Case works. So they go in, they talk to the receptionist, they get to meet Roy Case, and he very quickly says that they should probably investigate MZTV. Because not only is that the last place that Tina was, but as he explains, MZTV is a bit of a mystery, because it didn't exist less than a year ago, but suddenly it's on all of these televisions all around town. They're putting a lot of money into marketing, but strangest of all, at least from his perspective, is that they only ever seem to air old black and white movies, really cheesy ones from like the 1940s and 50s, and yet it's insanely popular. So he says that that should be the first place that they investigate. They also have a little look around at SBTV because he wants to show them a little bit about how a television studio works. And so they see the different people working in the area. They've got little studios. He also goes up to the roof and shows them the broadcasting tower. Also, this is a minor issue, but it did start to bug me. As Roy Case is showing them this studio, he introduces them to Andy Hitchman, who is the head of broadcasting at SBTV. But Andy isn't really an interesting character. I think he shows up once later on. But this book and the author Stephen Bokert seems to have some obsession with giving the first and surnames of characters whose names you don't need. Like Mark's mother, Sarah Watkins. We learn that very early, even though she is Mark's mum. You can just call her Mark's mum throughout the story, Mrs. Watkins. We also learn that Gary and Layla's parents are called George and Renata Swan. We later learn that the sergeant's full name is Tony Holmes, and he works with his officer Connor. And we later learn the name of the janitor is Torrance, which I wonder if that's just a reference to The Shining, but it doesn't really matter because I don't really need to know all of these names, yet the book seems obsessed with making sure you know the first and last names of all the characters who pop up in the book, even if all they do is say a single line of dialogue. And whilst it's not necessarily a bad thing, I found it annoying and unnecessary that we are constantly learning the names of characters who do not matter to the story. And yes, like I said, not necessarily a bad thing, but it was distracting and really didn't help the story much. But anyway, after this meeting is all done, our kids go home, and so Mark, and in fact, Gary and Layla come with him when they talk to Sarah, and they explain that they're going to meet up with Roy Case and try to solve this. And I like that she's a little bit pessimistic, saying, look, I know that he solves all the cases on TV, but that's because that's good television. They're not going to show the cases he doesn't solve. So I like that, throws a little bit of intrigue there. But then, once the other kids go home and Mark goes to bed, he's struggling to sleep that night because he's worried. And there's a scene where he's looking out the window, and then he sees that some of his neighbors, the carpenters, they seem to be watching television, even though it's really late at night. In fact, I don't think the book covers it exactly, but it seems to be either midnight or past midnight. And then there's a bright flash, and he decides to call them to see if they're alright. Apparently it's that kind of a neighborhood, they're close enough. So he goes downstairs, but when he picks up the phone line is dead. So again, we're getting some weird crossed signals, having issues. And so he decides, okay, well maybe I'll just go and check on them. So he leaves the house, and he goes to the carpenter's house to knock on the door. He went through the front gate to the carpenter's house, slowly as he approached the front door, then rang the bell. He heard it sound deep in the house, but nobody came. He pressed the button again, and a third time, shivering now in the night chill as the wind stirred and twirled around him beneath a shadowy porch. Part of Mark's mind told him that the best thing to do was go home and play Mutant Wars like he wanted. But another inner voice was persuading him to take a look around, because something was obviously wrong here. He sighed and walked to the side of the house to peer through the lounge window, where the curtains had been opened. They were still there, allowing him to glimpse Mrs. Carpenter slumped in an easy chair, gazing with glassy, empty eyes at some old black-and-white movie playing on the television. Mark thought it looked really boring, but the old lady was obviously enjoying it, because her mouth was hanging open, and amazingly, she didn't blink once. He shrugged and was about to turn away when a figure rose up in the room, pressed its hands against the glass, and glared at him. "It's okay, Mr. Carpenter," Mark began. "It's only—" But the words died in his throat. The old man's eyes were flaring with blizzards of glowing particles. He opened his mouth and said something to Mark, but all he heard was the hissing of a dead TV channel as he stumbled backwards away from the window, wonder and awe and terror rising through him like a wave. So, TV zombies. I'm not going to lie, that's kind of interesting. So, this seems to finally be setting it down. So, our main character lost his sister, that's the inciting incident, but the main conflict is these TV zombies. And since they've got this Roy Case guy alongside, it means that we'll be uncovering this mystery as the story unfolds. So, the next day, our kids head towards MZTV with Roy Case. And our Mark tries to explain what he saw, and the other kids aren't really believing him, but they are intrigued by what he saw. They think that it might have something to do with this MZTV place. So, once they meet up with Roy and he heads in, Roy does make some mention that the reason he was late is because they were having some trouble at SBTV, possibly due to electric static charge. But they head to MZTV, so fascinatingly, everything around it is a bit of a wasteland because they're in an industrial, dead, really poorly managed part of town. And so it's strange that this beautiful building is rising up from what looks almost like abandoned wreckage. In fact, our main character makes a reference to Mutant Wars, that game with the Reptiloids he was playing, because it looks like a post-apocalypse. They head inside, and they notice that there are these teenage guides who are walking around offering people, promotional packages, even radio, what do you call them, Walkmans? Yeah, little Walkmans playing some sort of song. I think it goes MZTV, MZTV, you're the only one for me. I mean, the pattern doesn't work. But the important thing is there's all kinds of promotional stuff. They've got hats, and they've got t-shirts, and they've got packages they're trying to hand out to people. And then they're going to give them a little tour of the studio, because they seem to be putting a lot of money into this promotion. But there's two weird things. First of all, I mean, it's weird that they're promoting so much, even though they seem to just be showing old black and white TV stuff, so they're not sure where all the money's coming from. But more importantly, the tour guides, even though they're young and they look like regular kids, as you get closer, they all seem to be wearing ridiculously thick makeup. Like, you can't see any of their skin underneath it all. It is just thick, caked on foundation and lipstick and eyeliner, making them look weirdly artificial. And then, as they explore the place, they show off some of their different areas. And of course, Roy and the kids decide that they're going to peel off and have a little look at somewhere that's not on the tour. And they peek through one of the doors. They realize that they've stumbled outside. Even though they're inside, it's like the door opens up to outside and it's full of fog. And suddenly Roy panics. He grabs the kids and he pulls them back inside. And then this book does something that, whilst it's interesting, I wasn't the biggest fan of. The book then switches perspective to Roy, the adult character, and we learn that the reason he pulled them back in is because through the fog he saw a security guard with a dog, but the security guard looked gaunt and inhuman, and the dog didn't have any fur and its eyes were blazing red. Something unnatural is going on. And then, the next chapter, we are following it entirely from Roy's perspective, so this seems to switch to a kind of neo-noir detective story for a little second. So, we follow the story from Roy's perspective as he decides that they need to head out and they'll do more exploring later. The kids all want to know what he's talking about, what he saw, because he's definitely hiding something from them. But he says, no, it's nothing, don't worry about it, I'll deal with this, maybe this is sort of an adult thing, and the kids are very upset, but he takes them home, and there's even a little moment, because of course there has to be, where Roy is talking to Mark's mum, Sarah Watkins, and they seem to be flirting a little bit, It's not that important to the story, but I think it's cute, especially for a mother who has lost her partner, and she's clearly lonely, she wants something in her life. And there's even a little moment where Mark, upset that someone is intruding on that space. In fact, because we've got Roy's perspective now, he even says that he doesn't blame Mark for snapping when he sees him flirting with his mum, because he's been the man of the house for 4 years now, and so seeing someone intrude on that territory, well, it's understandable that he wasn't appreciating that. But then Mark leaves them and he goes to his own apartment, and he's sitting in his apartment, drinking something from a mug, which we don't elaborate on, but it sounds like it might be whiskey. And he's thinking about this mystery, thinking, well, that Sarah lady was sure pretty, but I don't want to go intruding on some family, not if it's going to be upsetting things. But more importantly, what is the mystery of this MZTV? What am I going to do about it? And he decides that the best thing to do is, rather than follow the tour, he wants to go there at night. He wants to sneak in there at night and answer some of these questions he has. Like, why is this thing built in the middle of wreckage and rubble? And who is Max Zoffany? By the way, yeah, MZTV stands for Max Zoffany TV. At first I thought this was another example of overdoing the first name surname thing, but I guess it sort of plays out later. And so a guy, packs up, he gets ready to head out to explore this place at night. And again, it really does feel like we're in a bit of a detective noir story here. He parked 2 blocks away from the studios and walked the rest of the way to Hobbs Lane. The streets were deserted, as Roy had expected them to be. A few ancient street lamps cast sparse, dismal circles of amber light along the pavement. At the far end of the block, the MZTV building stood like a grey glass headstone in the dead wilderness, its many windows glinting in the upward slanting beams of a single, powerful spotlight. Roy kept to the shadows, which was easy to do as he made his way quickly and silently to the gate in the chain-link fencing that bordered Zoffany's land. Upon reaching the gate, he saw the padlock lying at his feet. It had been sawn cleanly through. He picked it up and hefted its weight in his hand while he considered his options. It looked as though someone had broken in earlier. But who and why? Either that, or this was a clever trap, perhaps set for Roy himself. Maybe he'd been recognized on the tour as the famous TV detective, and Zoffany anticipated his return. If this was true, then Zoffany certainly had something to hide. Roy placed the padlock back on the ground and eased himself through the metal gateway. His eyes by now had adjusted to the darkness. He could make out the jagged hills of old brickwork, the rusted iron girders thrusting up from the soil like the skeletal remains of some vast prehistoric beast. Tangles of wire and scattered spars of wood, all that now remained of whatever had stood here in the past. No light was showing from any of the windows in the studio building, so maybe Roy thought he was in luck. His plan was to enter by the doorway Layla had stumbled through earlier. That would lead him right to the heart of the studio. Roy squinted as he picked his way carefully over the broken ground, then fell back with a cry as a dark shape rose up in front of him and grabbed hold of his jacket. For a few dreadful seconds, all of Roy's childhood nightmares surged back through his mind, those early fears of the dark and the monsters it contained. His arms flailed out as he struggled to dislodge the clinging thing from his body. Then cool reason flooded through him. He stopped struggling, realizing that whoever this person was, he was terrified, much more frightened than Roy was. "Hey, take it easy, it's okay, it's..." The person looked up at him, and Roy's eyes widened. "Mark," he said in utter shock. "What the hell are you doing here?" So then we get a scene where Mark explains that he knew Roy was keeping stuff from him, so he decided, well, if he doesn't want me to be involved in his investigation, I'll have my own. So he snuck in, and he was the one who cut the padlock earlier. But he's clearly terrified, and when Roy asks him why, he explains it's because something was moving under the ground earlier. He asks him to show him what he's talking about, so he brings him over to a patch of ground, and then we get this incredible scene that, I just have to share this with you. The ground was moving. Just as Mark had said, the whole crater floor seemed to be rippling, lifting upwards into a vast dome of dirt and rocks. Then the dome split into a hail of small stones and fragments, and from out of it rose huge black girders that surged closer and locked together in a clanging cacophony of sound, like the work of invisible giants. Hundreds of bricks followed after, each one glowing a dull red, as though fresh from the kiln. They flung themselves at the tower's structure of metal, miraculously tumbling into place to form bare walls. Then unbroken sheets of glass slid from the soil and flew upwards, spinning in the night, fitting neatly into the newly created window spaces. Finally, showers of rivets, nails, trims, scraps, and fragments swept up into the air and swirled around the edifice, rattling and tinkling on the metal and brick and glass until each one could slot perfectly into place. Both Roy and Mark had hunched down instinctively to avoid being hit, and had so far escaped harm, but now out of the ground burst a geyser of intense blue flame that sprayed across the flamework, licking it over with the fire. In seconds, the heat became unbearable. Honestly, I don't think we needed to know where the building came from, but that scene was really cool, seeing it rise from out of the ground and piece itself together. In fact, it's not done. The scene continues as Mark and Roy then have to dodge as flames come out, sort of welding the thing together as it starts blasting it with blue flame, and then more bricks and things start flying around. They have to dodge them and move them, and after it starts to settle and the building is pieced together, then from out of the ground bursts that guard with his guard dog that we saw earlier. And then we get something of an action scene, which, whilst it is very cool, I have to admit, I was a little bit disappointed because it seemed like it was going more for action than horror, because, yeah, Roy then fights off the guard, and so he has to actually punch him and roll him around and throw him about the place, and the whole time it's screeching, and it's got those glowing TV flickering lights, like TV static in its eyes, and the dog with the glowing red eyes, and so they kill the dog by putting the light on it, and so it disintegrates because it's a creature of darkness, and then they're fighting the guard, but the guard is actually made of bone, so even though he is also empowered by this darkness, he still has a body, and so they have to keep fighting him, and they get in the car, and they have to drive around, and he's chasing after them, they have to run him over with the car, but as they do, the dog then comes back and reforms, and it smashes through the windscreen, and they then get the head of the guard, they run him over and his head goes flying through the car. And again, it seems more action than horror. I think that a lot of this could be really intense, but it seems like it's going more for a whiz-pow bang sort of a scenario than a, oh my god, this undead thing is here attacking us. So after that whole action scene, Roy drives Mark home, and he says to him that they can't tell anyone about what's happened, because clearly they're dealing with powers way beyond their understanding or control, and the less people know the better, which really sucks for Mark, because now that Roy seemed to be doing his own thing, he and Layla and Gary had decided to go to MZTV on their own to do a bit of investigating. So the next day, Mark is there with Layla and Gary, and this is because at first I thought we were back with Mark's perspective, but no, we have another POV switch, and now we seem to be following Layla, because Layla is there talking to Mark, and she's saying, look, we can't really get much here, we tried the tour, we didn't learn anything, maybe MZTV isn't involved at all, and Mark wants to tell her what he knows, but Roy made him promise that he wouldn't, so he decides to just let the moment pass, but they're more distracted by the fact that Layla's brother Gary seems to have drunk the Flavor Aid while they weren't paying attention, because he's bought all this promo stuff, he's wearing the shirt and the hat, and he's listening to that Walkman with that stupid, MZTV, you're the only one. I don't know how to sing it because it doesn't fit a rhyme scheme, but what matters is that he seems to be being affected by this stuff. So that night when Layla goes home, she's a little concerned that her brother is missing, but her mum doesn't seem worried at all. In fact, they're going to a dinner party, and when Layla suggests that maybe she could go out and look for her brother, her mum says, no, I don't need two kids wandering around on a foggy night like this. He'll show up, he's probably just playing at the arcade like he usually does. Because, because he's so obsessed with video games, it makes sense. I kind of like that makes sense for his character, but we all know the truth, that he's being affected by this MZTV stuff. But when her mother leaves, Layla's at home, she's hanging around for a bit, and she's watching a bit of TV when it turns to black and white static. And as she's watching, it seems to morph and change, and then it becomes faces like Mark saw earlier, except this time the face looks like her brother calling out for help. And then it seems to grow even larger, and we get a weird scene where it says that it looks like a white outline of a person, but it describes it as a shadow, and then it seems to grow and grow into like this white fire, and Layla panics and runs, and we get another action scene, but this time well, it's more like a chase scene, obviously, because she runs out, she sees that her brother's bike is there, so she jumps on this bike and she starts pedaling as fast as she can away, but she can't escape because this weird staticky fire, this white light, has gone from her house to the next house, catching it alight, and then the next one alight, and it's gone from house to house to house, and it's creating these huge bursts of light. And I love the way it's described. It says that each time there's a new flare of light, it stamps her shadow onto the road as she tries to pedal further and further away, but it's getting closer and closer. And then ahead of her, she sees this storm drain cover suddenly bursts out, and then these live wires, as in they're moving wires of spark electricity, these television cables come flying out, and one of them tangles itself into the front wheel of the bicycle, immediately causing it to stop, so it gets thrown out from under her as she flies forward, lands heavily on her side, and she's about to get captured by the wires when someone appears and grabs the wire and throws it into the storm drain, causing it to spark and die. And she finally loses consciousness because she hit her head as she carried him off the bike, so she loses consciousness as she gets saved by Roy Case, and she disappears into blackness. When she finally comes back to consciousness, she's there with Mark, who came with Roy, because when they realized that Gary was missing, they thought that maybe Layla was in danger too, and they came there just in time to see all these houses bursting into staticky fire, and the wires came out, so they managed to save her just in time. But now Roy is talking with the police. There's flashing lights all around as he's talking with the cops, and we learn about Tony Holmes and all of the full names we don't need. But the most important thing is that she learns that that fire, that staticky light that was coming after her, was obviously this power of the MCTV station, that same one that's making people go missing, because every single house on that street is empty now, having been absorbed by the staticky light. And whilst they try their best to explain what happened to the police, they don't really understand. They think something else has happened. They don't really believe exactly what they're being told. I mean, they trust Roy, but most importantly, the police say, look, they'll try to help, but they've got bigger problems on their hands because a lot more people than this have gone missing. And so the police all over town are trying to find all of the missing people, not just the ones on this street. So after all that, we get a little lull in the intensity because our kids and their parents, they realize that because Layla just got attacked, and Roy obviously was the one that saved them, and also partially because his part of town doesn't seem to have been attacked by this missing people thing yet, the Watkins and the Swans decide to move into Roy Case's place, just for the time being. And so yeah, there's a little bit of humor as they're moving their cases in and they're getting used to the new area. And then Layla talks with Roy and Mark admits that yeah, they did know a little bit about this, they didn't want to reveal it, but then they felt bad and decided they probably should now, especially after she was attacked. They realized that she was vulnerable, and so they talk about all they know about this MZTV place. The next day, the action picks right up, because Roy heads into the SBTV studio with both of the kids, because apparently they heard something about an MZTV takeover. And when they say takeover, it's not some sort of a merger or acquisition, because when they head in, they see that all the televisions are playing the staticky broadcasts of the black and white movies, of two lovey-dovey people saying, "Oh, you mean everything to me," and the woman with the made-up hair saying, "Oh, I love you forever, darling." So it's really cheesy dialogue and stuff. But what matters is that it's starting to turn people against one another. People who are watching the screen seem to turn into those TV zombies and attack. And it seems like the broadcast from SBTV is also becoming staticky and getting taken over. So everyone is going crazy. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and then people are fighting because the TV zombies are attacking. But because of something that Mark says about how he doesn't understand how the MZTV became so powerful underground, like they just seem to appear out of nowhere, and that's when Roy realizes, wait, no, underground. All the cables are coming from underground. They came from the drains, they came from inside people's houses. It's not attacking from the broadcast tower down, it's attacking from the basement up. So they head downstairs where they see the janitor that they call Torrance, but he's been taken over. He is covered with wires and he's throwing them around like whips. This is like a boss battle because the kids are being attacked, but I kind of like the way this works because they don't have any weapons. They're just sort of running around hoping for the best. Because as soon as Roy sees him, he goes to attack him and he flicks a wire at him, and it not only does it hit him and throw him back, but he gets tased effectively by this stuff, and it zaps the crap out of him, throws him into the wall. So it's just the kids fighting, but they can't touch him, even though they need to stop him somehow. And it's only after desperately running around for a while that Layla realizes, because he's covered in electricity, the only way to stop him is with some kind of a short circuit. So with some of the fires that are caught because of the electricity catching things on fire, she uses her jacket, she catches it on fire, and then throws it up at the sprinkler system above, which sets off the fire alarm and starts spraying water down, which finally sparks torrents. He starts steaming and frying, electricity, going all over his body as he collapses. But even though they've stopped the janitor who's downstairs, this boss battle thing, they see that the cables are still crawling up through the walls, along the walls away from the water, and they realize that the cables are going up to the tower, because as soon as they can get to the broadcast tower, it can infect every single television in the broadcast area. And so desperately they go running upstairs. They got Roy, he's finally coming to, but as soon as he gets to the next floor up, he sees that basically all of the workers are being taken over by the TV zombies, and so they're fighting. And so he says, look kids, you wait here, I'll slow this down. And so he dives into the fight of the TV zombies as it's just Layla and Mark going upstairs to the tower, and they see that it's raging with a storm outside. They say that maybe the static in the air has collected all of the clouds, but it's raining, which means that the cables aren't visible yet. They can't see them. The only thing up there seems to be some sort of a station, like an engineer station. And so they run in there only to get attacked by Andy Hitchman, who, I think in an earlier scene he said he was running up to check on the tower, but apparently he's been affected by this TV signal, and so he's a TV zombie too. And so he's flicking around cables just like Torrance was, but he's stuck inside that little hatch. And so Layla, she sees him throw one of the cables and she manages to dodge it, then grabs it and pulls him out, short-circuiting him in the rain as well. But as they're looking around, they see that some of the cables have burst through the ceiling. And it doesn't go into too much detail, but I'm assuming that because they're under the tower, they're sort of protected from the rain, and so it's sort of sneaking carefully up the tower, these huge cables, these huge thick cables, and so the kids can't stop them, and they can't climb the tower, and that's when Mark says to Layla, fire! And it takes her a moment to realize, he got attacked earlier, that's why he's like staggering, like, oh, fire! And he explains, no, fire hose, because there's a fire hose reel, and so he and Layla work to grab the hose. He's still on the ground, but he's basically holding it so that the pressure doesn't throw her off her feet, and they manage to arc the fire hose up so that it hits the very tip of the cable, which sends it bursting into flames, and then it collapses down and starts smoking on the roof as the storm starts dissipating. But don't get your hopes up yet, because as they meet with Roy downstairs, who says that he did his best, he's like bleeding from the face, he's been in huge fights, but he says that the fight isn't over yet. This is only the beginning. They need to go to the source at MZTV to stop this thing. After this whole scene, they head back to Roy Case's apartment, and there's a little bit of panic because we see that those cables have plugged themselves into the power box at the base of the apartment building. So they go racing up and they see, sure enough, those MZTV cheesy old romance movies are playing in black and white on the TV, and both the Watkins and the Swan families are entirely missing. So after disabling the TV, smashing it and stopping all that, the kids are upset. They want to know what's going on. They're screaming about why. And Roy understands, they have a right to be upset. They've lost their entire family. But after about 10 minutes, he stops them and he says, look, this isn't helping. We need to figure out why this is happening. And then we get this little scene, which is the closest we ever get to fully explaining why. I'll let the book explain it before I go into a bit more detail. If we rush in blindly, then we won't stand a chance. Zophany will be waiting, and behind Zophany, the shadow. Mark shivered as though someone had walked over his grave. What do you think the shadow is? He asked in a small voice. Roy considered this for a moment, his gaze moving beyond them to the window and the distant horizon. Something very ancient. Something filled with bitterness and hate. A figure that hangs like a mist in the background when there's violence or war or unhappiness. Its heart is twisted. It despises a laughing child or two young people in love. It hides from the sunshine. It loathes and fears courage and hope, which is why, Mark, Layla, we need to have both in the days to come. The tone of Roy's voice had changed. It was almost as though he was speaking to himself alone, lost in a past he had half forgotten. Layla and Mark glanced at one another. Then Layla went over and touched Roy's hand. How do you know all of this? She wondered softly. I'm older than you. I've seen more. My work has taken me to some dark and terrible places. I've glimpsed the shadow moving there behind things. I've seen its face. What does it look like, Roy? Mark was thinking of the reptiloids and other monstrous creatures from his game of Mutant Wars. Would it have purple skin or green? And would its mouth be black or red inside? And with how many dagger-like teeth? Roy Case smiled at the boy, pleased that he was still just that. At least he and Layla too had not been tainted by the shadow's bitter cold touch. He shrugged. It has many shapes. A crying baby, an old woman who seems to be lost, a handsome young man in a suit, or the most beautiful girl you ever saw. But that's its outside face. Within, it is so distorted that you may not even recognize it. And is it just called the Shadow? Layla asked. It has 1,000 names, some of which I guess we have never discovered. What name do you give it, Roy? Roy regarded the boy frankly. Before looking away, he spoke as if in pain. In the night, in the dark, when I wake from a nightmare that haunts me even though my eyes are open, I know the shadow has passed over. And at such times, I call it despair. Now, I am of two minds about this. I do kind of wish that we had a more clear understanding of what it was, but this could just be my hyperliteral mind. I'll admit that that's a personal preference, so I do kind of like the way that they're leaning poetic into this. This is just the idea of personified despair. And that's when they realize, wait a minute, we haven't even looked up the fact that this is called MZTV, Max Zophony TV. And so they go looking through the encyclopedias that Roy has, and they find Max Zophony. And sure enough, he's a real guy. He was born in the late 1800s, in fact. And he had a television studio called Phoenix Pictures, which makes sense. They did make some references to the symbol of MZTV being a phoenix. He had a really popular studio that made really good movies, all kinds of movies from the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But around the 60s and 70s, he started losing his popularity because his movies weren't the style of the time anymore. They were outdated. So he became desperate, and in fact then he died in a fire. And so there's always this rumor that he either did this for insurance fraud or he killed himself in the fire. And so that's the answer we're looking for. The reason why all of this is happening is because Max Zophony, because he was no longer popular and wants his films to be seen, fell victim to despair. So, knowing this, they head to MZTV the next day. And Roy, he calls up the sergeant to try to get him to help, and the sergeant says that he believes him because he's been watching MZTV, and he's noticed that the actors on the TV look a lot like the missing people. And when Roy realizes, wait, you're watching? No, stop watching, you can't watch it. And we actually hear over the phone as Sergeant Holmes gets taken by this force. And so then he has to call up the officer, Connor. This is why it's frustrating, there's so many names. But he calls up Officer Connor, organizes for them to go to the station. And so he and the kids arrive at the studio, and shortly after, about a dozen police cars are there. And Roy's saying, is this everyone? Where's the rest of them? And the cop explains that because there's so many missing people, they're out looking for them, but he's called in the backup. He's called the fire brigade. So now they're all ready, the kids, they get ready to go towards the studio, and two zombie-like things come out. They're talking about them being like ghosts because they look like old movie. I mean, their clothing is tattered and their hair's falling out, but what is left looks like hyper-dyed blonde hair, and the old-fashioned clothes from the 40s and 50s, and they're stuttering as they talk, but they sound like old movie people. It's a bit weird because then they hear the chanting of that MZTV, MZTV, you're the only one for me, as hundreds and hundreds of people, both the employees, the people dressed with the weird makeup, but also several people who've been controlled by this are marching towards them. So it's forcing them into the building, which means that Layla, Mark, and Roy, they go running in and they have to push past these weird ghosts. And even when they push them apart, they fall into dust, but they're still like talking in that weird way. It's really creepy. But then they go in and they have to fight through more of those people, who are in this weird robotic way saying, you're not allowed here, the tour is over, all kinds of weird stuff. But it's mostly just an action scene of them fighting with when the fire brigade finally gets there, and they're using the water to blast the people and to get their way through the studio until they get to some kind of a movie theater inside of the studio, obviously for watching stuff, but it is full of people, all of them the missing people, and they are stuck like zombies in their chairs watching one of these old movies on the screen. And so Roy says, no, I'll save you. So he runs up and he sees that the projectionist room has an old projectionist who looks like he died a long time ago, but when he tries to turn off the thing, he's actually still a zombie, so he attacks him, and there's a bit of a fight scene as he manages to crumple him to dust, and then he bashes the projector with a baseball bat, and the screen warps and fades, and then it turns to white static, and the people in the room are suddenly coming back to reality. And so Roy gets down there, he starts telling him, oh, it's alright, we gotta get out of here, so he leads him towards the exit. But as he does, the screen is still showing an image. It's going from TV static to bright blood red. The screen had become redder somehow, and yet darker too, and caught on it like a moth trapped behind a lampshade, the figure of a man was struggling to be free. Roy hurried forward and leapt up onto the stage, Mark and Layla following closely behind. By the time they reached the spot, the fabric of the screen was bulging outwards, and incredibly, the rather plump body of the man was oozing through to drop with a thump to the floor. "It's Zoffany," Layla said quietly, recognizing him from his photograph at the library. "He doesn't look so tough," Mark sneered. Roy and Layla knelt beside him. Zoffany opened his eyes and gave a gurgling, strangled gasp, as though he'd been drowning. "You," his face squeezed up in a spasm of everything, "you freed me. He didn't keep his promise." Anger hardened his voice, but sorrow an instant later softened it once more. "I only wanted to entertain people, make them sad sometimes, but make their hearts glad in the end. Everyone finds joy in love." "We stopped the projector, Zoffany," Roy explained. "We broke the bargain, and so you have a second chance. Do you understand that? You can decide all over again what is the best thing to do." Zoffany's features twisted in deep regret. "I had my day, but I wanted it to go on forever. I wanted the crowds to love my pictures for all time. What a fool I was." He glanced at the faces of the rather stern-looking man and the pretty girl and the boy beyond them. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for all the harm I've caused. I'm sorry, and I have decided now what the best thing is to do. The bargain is ended. My day is done." "Mr. Zoffany," Layla stooped very near to him, for his eyes were closing and his grip on her hand was growing weaker. "I'd love to see your movies. I'll find them and watch them." The pudgy fingers squeezed her hand briefly, then relaxed. "And Mr. Zoffany, we forgive you." His hand flopped loosely to his side. Zoffany's slow, shallow breathing ceased entirely. "Leave him now," Roy whispered, easing Layla away. "It's time we were off." "It certainly is," Mark said, his voice rising in alarm. He pointed a trembling finger at the huge movie screen. It was much redder now, and a dry, painful heat was radiating from it. Patches of brown, scorching, were appearing here and there, and behind the screen, something was swiftly approaching. Something vast, something unbelievable. Oh, that's right, we're not done. They get attacked by despair itself. A huge, monstrous creature with claws and 1,000 eyes bursts through the screen, screeching with fire on its tail as it attacks them all. They go running out of the building, and they're using the fire hose trying to blast it back as they go, but it's barely slowing it down. Whilst it will slash through and try to get past them, it gets closer and closer with each claw digging into the ground and clawing closer towards them. In fact, Mark even tries to throw a knife at the creature and it hits it between the eyes, but all it does is it cuts a hole that a third eye breaches through and starts glaring at him menacingly. And so as he's trying to slow this thing down, blasting with water, then the firemen come racing past him with axes and with stomping boots. They attack the creature and they push it back. And as they do, the building is crumbling around them and a huge gaping hole appears in the ground, which the creature falls through. And it falls down into the darkness until it becomes a twinkling light that suddenly explodes. And everyone goes racing away as the building is crumbling into this hole. And then a huge blast like a volcano flies out of the ground, creating a huge heat wave until again it collapses and crumbles down into the ground, leaving nothing but rubble in its wake. It's a heck of an intense end to this story, but of course there's a little button on the end, a little closer, as finally, with all the people saved, Roy meets Sarah Watkins once again and is glad to see that she's safe, and she gives him a kiss on the cheek. because this is young adult, it seems to be leaning a little bit more into that, with the fact that it's a little bit more explicit on the romance as well as some of the drama, especially the interpersonal drama, the fact that our kid is now the man of the house, and that's openly stated, and he seems to get very aggressive when the detective wants to date his mum, or even just seems to appreciate the fact that she's a beautiful woman and lonely. Like, he gets aggressive about that. And then there's the interesting character dynamics of he's worried about his sister, and he's trying to do everything he can to make sure she's well. And then when their families go missing, they become really aggressive. Like, it seems more interested in that. Maybe it's because with middle grade, it doesn't want to face that stuff so front on, because it can be really intimidating, the idea of having to go through something like that, maybe for a little kid. But it does mean that if you're writing a story and you want to focus on some of that drama a bit more, you might have to lean a little bit older, that audience demographic. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The other thing is, I really loved some of the descriptions in this book, the way it described the way that the coiling wires moved, the way they described the zombies. I think that every single time it described them, even though it would often refer back to the fact that they had static in their eyes, it would describe it in different ways, like blazing black and white fire, or it would describe the way that the light came out of their eyes and the way that it absorbed their bodies, the way that they moved in unnatural ways. I really loved all the different descriptions there. And I also kind of enjoyed, like I said, the way that they had that evil villain thing, which they explained, but more in metaphor than any other way. Oh, and I need to talk about this. This is the thing that sort of bugged me. I was in two minds about this, because whilst I personally do prefer to explain stuff more literally, to actually have a physical, known, demonstrable threat, so like you know where it came from, you know the who, what, where, why, and why of it all of the questions you can have of it, I appreciate the fact that this was leaning more esoteric. But the downside of that, and this is part of the reason why I don't like it, is because the way that it's described in this book made it feel like it was just Satan. As in the Judeo-Christian, the devil, the Satan, the guy who is the epitome of evil in that religion. Because not only do they describe the fact that he obviously is despair, he's behind all the evil in the world, but also he's described as having fire all around him in hellfire. He comes from underground, and hell is usually depicted as being down as opposed to up, for hell down, heaven up. And the fact that he's surrounded by intense, unnatural fire, the fact that it has several eyes and claws and is red, like a lot of this stuff seemed to be feeding into that. You know what, I'm not a theologian, but my point is, it still felt like it was leaning into this Christian allegory thing, which I don't appreciate as someone who thinks that religion has no place in children's literature. I think that's harmful to kids. Admittedly, that's definitely my opinion, and not everyone agrees with me, but yeah, I didn't like that because of that reason. I felt like it was too easy to just slot in some pre-existing religious concept. Even though I really do like the idea of them just having this epitome of evil and despair. That's kind of interesting. And in fact, leaning more into the things that I found frustrating, yeah, I didn't really like the fact that they kept bringing up the first and last name of these characters, although that was just something that bothered me because I noticed it early on, and every time it happened, I found it distracting. Maybe that's just a personal issue. What isn't is the sudden perspective changes. For the entire first quarter of the book, this is Mark's story. I even described him as the main character. He's the character we're following for the story. And then, not only do we switch perspectives, but we switch perspectives to an adult. You can usually tell the audience for a book because the main character tends to be a representative of that demographic. So they tend to be the age range of the audience who wants to read the book. Although occasionally for young adult and for middle grade, sometimes they'll make them a little bit older because some kids aspire to growing older and becoming more mature, so sometimes they're a little older, but not always. So the point is, I found it very odd that they switched to an adult perspective in this kid's book, which took the power away from Mark, our main character. Especially for that scene, because whilst it's interesting to look at the detective's perspective, and I thought it was kind of funny that even though it does have very good descriptions throughout, it did seem to be leaning more into the detective stuff, I wandered through the shadows, trying not to be seen, that did feel like a detective story thing there. And in that scene, he meets up with Mark anyway, and to me that would have been a scarier moment, because Mark, earlier on in the scene, right, in the story, the detective is acting cagey because he saw something, and we know what he saw because we're doing some third-person omniscient which allows us to see into his heads, but I don't think that was necessary. What if the detective was acting strange? And so Mark decided, well, I can't trust him, I'll break into this place. And when he broke in, he saw Roy. And so then there's this bit of intrigue, like, is this because Roy is a bad guy? Is he working with them? And that's when we can learn everything that Roy saw, he can admit everything, and you can have that same scene, but from the main kid's perspective, and so it takes away that power, because adults have more power than kids, and so when writing a horror story, that's why it's fun playing with younger kids, because they can't just hop into a car and drive away if there's a problem. They can't use money or influence to change people's minds because they're kids. People don't trust them, they don't believe them, they don't have the economic power to do that kind of thing. That's why it's more interesting to have a disempowered character like that as your main character in a book, especially a horror book for kids. It's something they can understand and empathize with, and so I don't understand switching to him. I don't mind as much switching to Layla, but the thing is that happens so late in the book that it felt out of nowhere. Like, I don't know if I would have liked it if they introduced this concept of switching perspectives earlier, or maybe I think part of my issue is that because it seems to be taking this third-person omniscient view, following a main character and then going to another one more easily. Like, I admit that that's easier than if you're doing it from a first-person perspective, but it still felt awkward. Whilst I like the fact that they gave Layla a little bit of power, because, female character in a book, it's great that she's got some agency, I don't know if the book was improved by switching to her perspective for that moment. Ultimately, I found it more distracting than developing, and especially because it meant that later on in the story, when it seemed like I was second-guessing whether or not we were following a certain character at certain times. Like when they started going towards MZTV for the big fight, you notice there was that moment how Roy said, "Oh, I'll destroy the projector," and then we follow him near the end, even though that was near the climax of the book. And I was thinking, are we not even going to get the main character for the climax of the book? And yes, we do seem to get him when he's fighting, like he's the one holding the hose and fighting off despair, the despair incarnate. But yeah, I still felt like it was unfairly taking away his agency. So all that being said, I give this book a B+. It's a very interesting story. I mean, I don't like how loosey-goosey it felt near the end, but it is a really good story. It's really just held back, to me, by the awkwardness of that perspective shifting. I worry that this might just be my own bias. I don't think that's something that you're not allowed to do, but it just didn't feel like it was set up well in this story. Perhaps I would have enjoyed it more if they started as a group and then split up and then we followed different perspectives, but honestly, it felt like Mark's story and then it felt like it was taking his story away. So that was enough to knock this down to a B+. That and some of the awkward things with the naming and the unclear antagonist stuff near the end. So what can you learn from this book? It's actually something that did bother me. I actually stopped for a moment to do a bit more research on it. And that is the law of conservation of ninjutsu. What the heck am I talking about? Well, you notice in action movies, sometimes the antagonists will be ninjas, because ninjas are cool. But because your main character has to win in an action story, I mean most of the time, but if they're fighting 25 ninjas, usually they can knock each one down in one punch. They come flying at them, so it's like bam, 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 action man, and they throw them down to the ground. But if they're fighting one ninja, then suddenly it's a huge one-on-one action scene. The amount of time it took them to fight those 25 ninjas, you need twice as long to fight this one ninja because of the conservation of ninjutsu. Because if every single ninja was as powerful as that guy, then the story's over. You fight two of them at once, you're dead, because he took so long just to fight one of them. So the story means that you have to scale down the power of an incredibly powerful character when there's more of them. Hence the law of conservation, because they're conserving the amount of ninjutsu. This reason I'm bringing this up is because not only did the story feel like it was doing some action scenes with the way that it was doing the fights with the TV zombies, but did you notice that early on in the book, 2 TV zombies, or 1.5, he had sort of a weird night dog thing. It was a whole scene, they needed to fight them, and then they had to run away with the car, and then they had to smash them with the car, like they could barely fight them. And then in a later scene, when there's 20 of them in a room, and they didn't even have a car, they didn't have any weapons, and yet Roy Case managed to fight them with his fists, and it just felt wrong. And there's nothing wrong with this twist in action movies. Like, I get it, it's a bit silly. You can even sort of justify it by saying that they sent the mooks in first and then you're fighting the guy who trained them all. But in this story, they're all just TV zombies. They're all just zombies. And the important thing when it comes to writing horror stories is that whilst it can be fun to have that one-on-one action scene in an action story, in horror you want it to be scary. And so to make it scary, making your monsters less powerful when there's more of them goes against that. Which is why the rule to keep in mind here is that less is more. You don't need to have dozens and dozens and dozens of monsters to make your story scary. Start with one. Show how scary one is. And then throw in 3. That may not seem like much, but if you've shown that your heroes had a hard time stopping one monster, making 2 or even 3 can be enough to send chills down your spine. Hey, we lost 4 friends just killing this one. Now there's 3. We have no chance. You can understand how that would be more intense than suddenly throwing 25 of them at you, because, I mean, yes, whilst that's also impossible to stop, I think that it should scale well. To me, having so much effort killing 2 zombies and then suddenly there's 20, the only option is run. And yet, for this story to work, because they need to be in that place, they can't run away, they needed to stop them. And so, remember that less can be more. You don't need to throw a million things at your reader. If one of them is enough to stop them, then 3 is enough to kill them, 5 is enough to potentially end all life in that town. You don't need to go scaling up and then have them defeat them like they're big damn heroes, because it is less scary. It does depend on what you're going for, but for this story, I felt like it didn't add to it. The second thing I think you could learn from this book, and it's interesting because it's in inverse to what I just said, but it comes with some caveats, and that is, sometimes you can go big. And what I mean when I say that is, I didn't like any of the action scenes in the story because they were action scenes. Action means your main character has to have agency and power so that they can overcome what is happening to them. They need to be a creature of action. This is meant to be a horror story, meant to be all in your head. But to me, the 3 scenes that I found the most impressive were ones when the main characters had something huge happen that they had no control over, that they couldn't stop. So the very first one, I really enjoyed that scene where the building was building itself. Was that necessary for the story? No, we probably could have figured that it came from the ground since it collapses in later. But it was really cool, the idea of them watching as this huge thing is being pieced together. In fact, they have to dodge the bricks as they're flying through the air, and there's flames going everywhere. They couldn't stop it, but it meant that the bigness of that scene added to the tension, because they just had to sit back and watch as something beyond their control was becoming more powerful. Same thing happened when Layla was being attacked by that static flame that came from her television and then flooded her entire neighborhood. All she could do was run, and yet it was this huge moment. It took every single person from her street and stole them away, and all she could do was run, and in fact she nearly lost her life. Well, I mean, she was nearly kidnapped, I suppose, but we didn't even know what was happening to the people who were taken, so she was nearly taken away by this thing, and at the last second she was saved by someone else because she didn't have the power to stop, to run away fast enough, and then she got lucky. Like, that is a huge moment. In fact, I even like, near the end, I don't know if it was necessary, but I also liked how cool it was, that scene, how the whole screen in the movie theater was turning slowly red, and then this body emerged, glowed, and then melted from the screen and flopped, and it turned out to be the guy behind it. And yeah, it turned out to be a nice scene before it became the attack of despair who suddenly burst through the screen and set it alight. But it's another example of how the reason why I like when all these scenes were so big is because, yes, it's intense, it's action-filled. Like, if it was in a movie theater, this is the special effects shot, this is the money shot. You need to make sure it's really cool, really big, it catches attention, but it matters to the story because it takes the power away from the main characters. They see the power of the thing they're facing up against, and they need to overcome it. And it was also incredible visuals, incredible imagery. I haven't seen that kind of an image in a Chapterspooks story in a while. And it happened 3 times in this one, and in every single time, it was showing them just how out of control, how powerful the monsters were, how screwed the main characters were. And to me, that is when you go big. Obviously, to a degree, when they can still fight back, because if you want your characters to defeat the villains in your story, that is. But you can go big if you can do so in a way that is intimidating and adds tension. I think that's the key. Go big if it makes it intense. So, that was FunFax Horror number 1, Panic Station by Stephen Bockett. Oh, and I was going to mention, I just think it's funny, so feel free to check out Stephen Bockett. He seems like a pretty good writer, all told. I really like the way he uses language, but if you want to see more of him, and in fact, if you want to see one of the particular characters in this, when I was looking up the sort of writing he did. He's done all kinds of things. He used to be a teacher, he was a hypnotherapist, but he also wrote a graphic novel called Roy Kane, TV Detective. And I can't help but feel that that character was almost 100% inspired by Roy Case from this book. In fact, on some of the covers I found on Amazon where they sell it, they say that the person he's fighting against is called the Shadow Man. So for all we know, we could get Roy Case fighting the Shadow, or Roy Kane fighting the Shadow Man, as it were, if you check out that book by Stephen Bockett. But more importantly, this is a fun start to this. I'm looking forward to them. Finally, I'm getting some books that were really well written, even though there's some things I didn't like. And whilst I need to put in the effort to make sure I don't tear the pages, I'm looking forward to the next one of this series. And if you are too, well, hey, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.